Sex, survival, scandal. Three words that barely scratch the surface of the Bible's most disturbing family secret. As the screams of the damned fade into ash, three figures stumble into darkness: a father and his two daughters, traumatized survivors of divine genocide. What happens next is so shocking, so taboo, that for thousands of years, religious leaders have sanitized it. Scholars have whispered around it, and artists have been simultaneously repelled and fascinated by its raw, primal darkness. In the stifling blackness of a mountain cave, convinced they are the last humans breathing on a charred earth, Lot's daughters make a choice that shatters one of humanity's most universal taboos. They made their father drink wine. The ancient text declares with unflinching brutality, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. Incest, intoxication, impregnation, not hidden in some obscure text, but prominently displayed in the sacred scripture of these three major world religions. This isn't just a scandalous biblical footnote. It's a blood-soaked window into humanity's most primal fear: extinction. From Mesopotamian gods ejaculating into their own daughters to create plants, to Egyptian pharaohs who married their sisters to keep bloodlines divine, to Chinese flood survivors begging heaven for permission to commit incest for the sake of humanity's survival. These myths expose our species' most ancient question: what moral boundaries would you cross to prevent your complete extinction? The daughters' desperate gambit worked. Two sons were born, Moab and Ben-Ami, whose descendants would become entire nations that shaped biblical history. Nations birthed in desperation, shadowed forever by their origins and mankind's ultimate taboo. Join us as we strip away centuries of religious sanitation to expose this ancient scandal and trace its echoes across world mythology. The story of Lot and his daughters isn't merely about incest. It's about survival, legacy, and the moral lines cultures draw, or cross, when facing annihilation. Before we journey deeper into this forbidden mythology, take a moment to subscribe for more unfiltered explorations of the hidden stories that religious authorities don't want examined too closely. The raw, uncensored myths that reveal who we truly are. In Genesis 19:30-38, after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his two daughters seek refuge in a cave. Believing they are the last people alive, the daughters devise a plan. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring through our father. For 2 consecutive nights they intoxicate their father and conceive children with him. These sons become the founders of 2 nations, Moab and Ammon, neighboring peoples of ancient Israel. Modern biblical scholarship recognizes this as an etiological myth, a story explaining origins. In this case, it paints the Moabites and Ammonites in a decidedly negative light, tracing their ancestry to an incestual act. The narrative contains no explicit moral condemnation within the text itself, but ancient audiences would have understood the implication. This was a scandalous and shameful origin for these nations. One compelling scholarly theory suggests that an older, perhaps Moabite version of this tale might have presented their ancestry in a positive, pure-blood light, which Hebrew authors then transformed into a story of depraved origins to disparage their neighbors. This critical interpretation views the Lot narrative as Israelite political satire, a clever literary device turning Moab and Ammon into descendants of an illicit union, thereby justifying historical tensions between these peoples. Biblical scholars also note striking parallels with the earlier flood story. After Noah's family survives the flood, Noah becomes drunk and an incident involving nakedness occurs, resulting in a curse on Canaan. Similarly, Lot survives destruction, becomes drunk, and his daughter's actions result in the stigmatized birth of 2 nations. In both narratives, sexual impropriety in a post-catastrophic setting serves to explain the troubled origin of neighboring peoples. These parallels are likely deliberate narrative devices, using the motif of a righteous man's disgrace to account for the perceived moral defects of rival nations. From a theological perspective, the story reflects ancient attitudes toward incest. Later Israelite law in Leviticus 18 strictly forbids such unions. The narrative subtly reinforces that taboo by showing that nothing morally good comes from the act, even without explicit divine punishment. Some feminist scholars have noted that the text refrains from overtly judging the daughters, possibly because they acted to preserve life, while other commentators emphasize that the episode underscores the depravity associated with Sodom. In the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia, we find some of the earliest parallels to the Lot narrative, though with significant differences in context and moral framing. One striking similarity appears in the Sumerian creation myth about the god Enki. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, this god of wisdom and water impregnates his own daughters and granddaughters in a paradise-like land called Dilmun. First, Enki lies with the earth goddess Ninhursag, who bears a daughter named Ninshar. Then, remarkably, Enki engenders a new goddess by coupling with Ninshar, his daughter. Even after being warned, another daughter, Utu, is seduced by Enki. The myth takes a humorous turn when Ninhursag must intervene as Enki falls ill from consuming plants grown from his own seed. She heals him by birthing 8 new deities from his body. While the tone of the Enki myth is more fantastical and even more comical than Genesis, both stories feature father-daughter incest resulting in new life. In Enki's case, the incest represents divine creativity, a mechanism for fruitfulness and proliferation, albeit presented with tongue-in-cheek humor. Another relevant aspect of Mesopotamian lore is the region's flood and survival myths. The Epic of Gilgamesh and the earlier Atrahasis epic recount a great flood from which a hero survives with family and animals. Unlike the Lot tale, those flood survivors don't resort to incest because multiple humans survive. The Bible's flood story similarly has Noah's 3 sons and their wives repopulating the earth. The Lot narrative creates a scenario even more dire. Only one man and his 2 daughters remain, forcing an incestuous repopulation strategy. This scenario is reminiscent of a widespread total destruction survival theme in ancient Near Eastern mythology, but given a unique twist. Some scholars suggest that the Sodom story deliberately borrows elements from Mesopotamian flood tales, creating a localized mini-flood narrative. Lot in the cave mirrors Noah in the tent. But whereas Mesopotamian survivors renew life under divine favor, Lot's family resorts to taboo means. It's worth noting that Mesopotamian law, like later Israelite law, viewed incest as illicit in human society. The laws of Hammurabi prescribe banishment for a father who sleeps with his daughter. Thus, any ancient Near Eastern audience would recognize Lot's daughter's deed as transgressive. Ancient Egyptian mythology and culture provides a fascinating contrast in attitudes towards incest. It was often idealized in the divine realm and practiced among royalty to preserve a divine bloodline. The clearest example is the myth of Osiris and Isis. The god-king of Egypt took Isis as his queen, and remarkably, Isis was both his wife and his sister. In Egyptian cosmology, it was normal for gods to be siblings and spouses. Another divine sibling pair, Shu and Tefnut, children of the creator Atum, and their children Geb, earth, and Nut, sky, further illustrate how the divine family tree folds back on itself. The sibling marriage of Osiris and Isis wasn't just mythological, it was mirrored in actual Egyptian royal practice. Pharaohs considered living gods often married their sisters to emulate the divine pattern and maintain the purity of royal lineage. Rulers in certain dynasties, particularly during the Ptolemaic period, routinely took siblings as royal spouses. In rare cases, pharaohs even married their own daughters. This practice was rooted in the belief that the royal family possessed divine ancestry. By incestually intermarrying, they maintained the creative potency and legitimacy given by the gods. Despite this acceptance of royal incest, Egyptian narratives don't showcase father-daughter incest in the same way as the Lot story. There's no direct Egyptian myth of a god who repopulates the world with his daughters after a catastrophe. However, the theme of extraordinary creation is present in Egyptian thought, notably in the god Atum's self-creation and the concept of divine birth of kings, where a god impregnates a queen. Contrast is striking. In Egypt, incest symbolized continuity of divine order, whereas in Genesis, it replicates degeneracy or abnormal circumstances. The story relocates the incest motif from the lofty realm of gods and kings to the dirt of a cave, perhaps deliberately to underscore that the Moabites and Ammonites lacked the divine sanction that Egyptian royal incest carried. Moving to the Greek world, we find several myths that echo the themes of incest and survival, though usually treated as tragic or problematic rather than divinely sanctioned. A striking parallel to the father-daughter incest motif is the myth of Myrrha, also called Smyrna. Cursed by Aphrodite with an unnatural lust for her own father, Myrrha deceives King Cinyras into sleeping with her by disguising herself in darkness. When he discovers the truth, the horrified father tries to kill his daughter, but the god transforms Myrrha into a myrrh tree. From that tree is born Adonis, the famously beautiful youth, whose beauty captivates even goddesses. Like Lot's daughters, Myrrha initiates intercourse with her unwitting father and conceives a child. Yet the motivations differ dramatically. Myrrha acts from cursed desire, while Lot's daughters act from perceived necessity, and the Greek myth emphasizes the tragic consequences, whereas Genesis focuses on the nation-founding outcome. Another relevant Greek mythic theme is repopulation after world catastrophe. The story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, sole survivors of a flood sent by Zeus, presents a creative alternative to incest. Landing on Mount Parnassus after the flood, this married couple consults an oracle about repopulating the desolated earth. The oracle cryptically tells them to throw the bones of your mother behind you. Interpreting mother as Mother Earth and bones as stones, they cast rocks over their shoulders. Miraculously, the stones transform into new people. Those Deucalion threw became men, and those Pyrrha threw became women. This stands in sharp contrast to Lot's daughters, who assume no divine intervention is forthcoming and take matters into their own hands. Where Genesis portrays a naturalistic approach, Greek myth offers a miraculous solution that sidesteps the incest taboo. Greek mythology includes other instances of incestuous relationships among mortals, nearly always with dire consequences. The tragic tale of Oedipus, who unwittingly kills his father and marries his mother, Jocasta, brings plague upon Thebes when the truth is revealed. These Greek myths use incest as the ultimate pollution, miasma, drawing divine wrath. Similarly, the Lot story results in lineages, Moabites and Ammonites, that Israel perceived as tainted or illegitimate. The key difference: Greek tradition tends to frame incest as a tragic destiny, whereas Genesis presents Lot's incest as a family event with long-term national repercussions. In ancient Persian, Iranian tradition, particularly as perceived in Zoroastrian texts, we encounter perhaps the most radical departure from the incest taboo. Zoroastrian cosmology developed the concept of exwedoda, meaning next of kin marriage, which included brother, sister, and even parent-child unions, as a sacred duty in certain contexts. According to Iranian myths, the first human beings were either a pair named Mashya and Mashyain, or a primordial man named Yima or Jamshid, and others. Later, Pahlavi literature explicitly states that the continuation of the human race required an incestuous union. This stands in stark contrast to the Indian Vedic view. In a Vedic hymn, Rigveda 10:10, the primordial twins Yama and Yami debate the necessity of incest. Yami urges her brother that they, as the first siblings, should unite to propagate humanity, but Yama firmly refuses, citing moral and natural law. The scholar Michael Witzel summarizes this cultural divide. In the Rig Veda, Yami tries to seduce Yama to produce children, but he refuses. In Iran, however, brother-sister incest was sanctioned. How does this relate to the Lot narrative? In theory, an ancient Persian might have interpreted the story less negatively, perhaps as an act of necessary exequatur to preserve human life. There's a hint of such cosmic thinking in the daughter's words. There is no man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the world, implying a world-rebuilding perspective. Yet the outcome in Genesis, two rival nations often hostile to Israel, suggests the Hebrew author did not view the act as pious or ideal. Instead of being praised, it becomes a mark of otherness and moral inferiority for Moab and Ammon. The Persian parallels also highlight the motif of survival. In later Persian epic, we find the myth of Yima creating a vara, enclosed refuge, to save creatures from a deadly winter, essentially a Persian Noah's Ark. When the world must be repopulated, the survivors would breed among themselves. While not explicitly described as incest, the theme of a closed gene pool is present. Lot's cave essentially functions as his vara, but without divine instructions. The Hittites, who ruled in Anatolia, modern Turkey, in the 2nd millennium BCE, provide additional context for understanding how ancient Near Eastern cultures viewed incest. While no Hittite myth directly parallels Lot's daughters, Hittite laws are explicit about incest prohibitions. The Hittite Law Code 189 states plainly, if a man has sexual relations with his own mother, it is an unpermitted sexual pairing. If a man has sexual relations with his daughter, it is an unpermitted sexual pairing. Parent-child sexual relations were forbidden, on pain of death or exile in Hittite society. This aligns with the general moral climate throughout the ancient Near East. Incest was strongly taboo in real life. The story of Lot would have been seen as shocking to a Hittite audience as to anyone else. Interestingly, Hittite and Hurrian mythology did include stories of unusual reproduction among the gods. In the Hurrian Kumarbi cycle, the god Kumarbi bites off his father's genitals and becomes pregnant with several deities, a bizarre inversion of normal procreation. In another episode, Kumarbi impregnates a rock, makes me think of Mithras, which bears the stone giant Ulikumi. While these aren't incest stories, they show a mythic willingness to explore non-normative reproduction in the divine realm. What's striking is that there was no positive sacred incest motif in Hittite culture. Hittite literature and ritual text emphasize purity and avoiding taboo. A Hittite would likely interpret the Lot story as an extraordinary tale of how two foreign peoples originated from a heinous act. Some scholars have suggested the Lot story functions as a mythic insult toward Moabites and Ammonites, similar to how many cultures create origin myths that denigrated their enemies. The theme of near extinction and world repopulation through incest or quasi-incestuous unions appears in various Eastern and Asian mythologies as well. In ancient India, early myth addressed this dilemma through the figures of Yama and his twin sister Yami. A Vedic hymn portrays Yami imploring Yama to lie with her to generate offspring, arguing the world is empty. We must act for the sake of humanity. Yama, however, firmly refuses. Later Hindu mythology contains an even more explicit incestuous episode involving the creator god Brahma. He creates a female deity, in some accounts Saravasti, called his daughter, and becomes enamored with her beauty. When he chases her with lust, other gods rebuke and punish him, clearly condemning father-daughter incest. Chinese mythology provides a striking parallel in the story of Fuxi and Nua. This brother-sister pair are often depicted as the only survivors of a great flood or as primordial beings in a newly made world. According to legend, after a devastating flood, Fuxi and Nuwa found themselves alone and charged with repopulating the world. Initially ashamed at the prospect of incestuous union, they prayed for a sign from heaven. When they set fires on two separate mountain peaks, the smoke trails miraculously joined, indicating divine approval for their marriage. In another version, rather than physically copulate, Fuxi and Nuwa molded human figurines from clay and brought them to life through divine power, creating humanity without direct incest. Similarly, in Japanese mythology, the first divine couple, Izanagi and Izanami, are brother and sister who marry and create the islands of Japan and many gods. Their union is portrayed as natural and necessary for creation. Throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific, we find tales of siblings surviving a flood and later marrying to continue humanity. Often, like in the Chinese story, they seek or receive divine permission, making incest exceptional and not to be repeated outside that context. In light of these, the story of Lot and his daughters can be seen as the Israelite version of a last pair on earth survival tale, but with a significant difference. Unlike the pious Asian examples who receive divine sanction, Lot's daughters act on their own initiative without God's blessing. The tone of Genesis is matter of fact and somewhat somber, lacking any celebration of humanity's salvation. This is because humanity wasn't truly at stake. Only Lot's family line was. His daughters weren't truly the last people alive. They merely perceived their situation that way, or perhaps used it as a pretext. The myth of Lot and his daughters, when viewed alongside these diverse cultural parallels, reveals a fascinating interplay of universal human concerns: survival, continuation, taboo, and moral boundaries. Across civilizations, we see that incest in mythology served as a powerful symbol with dual meanings: either the necessity of cosmic beginnings when no other existed, or the tragedy of moral breakdown when social order collapsed. Cultures choose different narrative solutions to the problem of human continuance after catastrophe. Some invoked divine miracles, Greeks with their stones to people, Chinese with clay figurines. Others permit one-time incest as divinely sanctioned, like Persian and some Asian traditions. The Hebrew Bible's approach is unique. It narrates the incest but attaches a sense of stigma to it. What emerges from the biblical account is a story that functions simultaneously as origin myth and cautionary tale. It explains the existence of neighboring peoples while subtly critiquing them. It acknowledges the desperate human desire to continue one's line while suggesting that without divine guidance, human solutions often go astray. Modern scholarship sees in the Lot narrative a sophisticated piece of ancient literature, one that draws on widespread mythic themes but adapts them to serve Israel's distinct theological and political propagandistic worldview. The enduring power of this story lies in its raw humanity. In that dark cave facing what they believed was the end of their world, Lot's daughters made a choice that violated a universal taboo, not out of lust or perversion, but out of primal fear of extinction. Their desperate act ensured their father's lineage continued, but at what cost? This ancient story, uncomfortable as it remains today, asks us to consider what truly preserves a people. Is it merely biological continuation at any cost, or adherence to moral boundaries even in the face of extinction? Different cultures answered differently, revealing their deepest values when confronted with the ultimate question of survival. What makes these ancient myths so powerful is that they continue to resonate with our modern anxieties about family, ethics, survival, and the lengths we might go to preserve what we hold dear. In exploring these stories, we discover not just ancient history, but reflections of our own humanity in all of its complicated glory. If you found this journey through ancient mythology as fascinating as I have, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us continue exploring the hidden stories that shaped our cultural DNA and still speak to us today. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear which cultural parallel you found most surprising. Till next time, remember that even the most disturbing ancient tales can offer profound insights into who we are and what we value most.